Good day, I am Mark Buckup and I'll be narrating you through my Module 2 infographic, connecting the Outcast archetype and thematic messages throughout multiple works, with both a historical and a new critic lens. I'll be dealing with the novel The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, as well as two poems, An Army Corps in the March by Walt Whitman and Night March by Herman Melville. The works will be analyzed based on the techniques of Laurence Perrine in The Nature of Proof in the Interpretation of Poetry, and of Simon Swift in What is a Symbol? What is a Metaphor? Briefly, we will initially address the interpretation techniques of Laurence Perrine in The Nature of Proof in the Interpretation of Poetry. Perrine describes the interpretation of poetry much like an ink block that could be understood in a variety of perspectives. Nonetheless, he mentions the limits to interpretation, emphasizing how there's not an unlimited array of interpretations. He also mentions the power of symbols and how the most accurate connections lie in the beam of light that is released in the celestial abyss of darkness. Overall, he has two general guidelines for interpretation. An understanding should not be contradicted by any detail, whether it be a mere word, and the interpretation with the fewest assumptions is the most reliable. A historical critic would research the context in which the work was written and assume that the stimuli during the era influenced the writer. Because Perrine chides assumptions in poetry, he therefore disapproves of assuming that these external stimuli influence the work. Additional context also limits as well as expands meanings, according to Perrine. He also believes that an author should not interpret his own poem, for it would limit the potential interpretations of future readers. By rejecting the time frame and the author's input, Perrine hence seems to support a new critic outlook. Simon Swift, on the other hand, seems to support a wider array of external sources to reinforce interpretations for poetry. Simon Swift is a speaker in What is a Symbol? What is a Metaphor? And a professor at the University of Leeds. He deeply expounds on the definitions and context for both symbols and metaphors and how they correlate and disparate from one another. Unlike metaphors, Swift argues how symbols are typical items in daily life, seen in mathematics, public plazas, restrooms, streets, devices, and a variety of other sources. Hence, there is an infinite amount of connections to be made supporting the notions to apply external pieces of information to ideas in the work. Metaphors, too, although limited to literature, require connection making and application. Unlike Perrine's rejection of an author's personal interpretation of his work, Swift advocates the poet's meaningful criticism, for it enlightens the reader with ideas that seem more widely in the canon. Acceptance of the poem's opinion in addition to the variety of connections made to the real world, hence, marks Swift as a strong advocate of historical interpretation. Transitioning to Tolkien's novel The Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins portrays his development as an outcast through a new critic lens. Somehow, the Hobbit Bilbo Baggins remains the outlier throughout all of his experiences, although maturing from this. Initially secluded in his home at the hill in Hobbitown, Bilbo is bombarded with guests and forcefully invited on an adventure that did not follow his typical routine. As the only hobbit present among a large group of dwarves and a wizard, Bilbo is treated much like a useless piece of furniture, unable to sustain the arduous pace and other obstacles throughout the journey. As the group visits the lands east, Bilbo remains to be the trespasser who does not belong. Even the trolls are unaware of what a hobbit is, and Smaug the dragon cannot identify his smell. Still, as Bilbo proves himself a worthy burglar, he betrays the dwarves to prevent an outbreak of violence, and once again is rebuked by the dwarf leader Thorin. Lastly, upon his return to his home, the other hobbits have already held an auction to sell Bilbo's belongings, for he left to foreign lands where regular hobbits usually do not venture to. Through all these instances, Bilbo is clearly depicted as the outlier. Another theme delivered solely through the content from within the novel is Bilbo's transition into becoming a hero, maturing as he realizes his potential and true identity. Unlike the other members on his 14-man journey, the Hobbit makes a commitment to abandon his daily routine and pursue a journey in lands that he presumed did not exist. He is the individual who dupes Gollum and steals an invisibility ring. He is also the heroic individual who, in fact, saves the others by defeating the Myrtwood Forest spiders, in addition to freeing his friends from the Wood Elves and investigating Smaug's lair inside the Lonely Mountain. Hence, a new critic lens, directed merely towards the novel, adequately investigates Bilbo's maturation and transition into a hero. Although he was forced to participate on the exotic adventure and become the outcast, he willfully chose to mature and become a hero. Being published in 1937 during a decade of much uproar and transition, The Hobbit portrays the outcast archetype not only through Bilbo but through a race as a whole. Thus, a historical lens allows external conditions to emphasize and connect ideas in the novel, perpetuating the outcast archetypes. During a period in which Nazism and fascism were escalating, racial supremacy had been a major matter of discussion during the era. Social Darwinism, the act of proving the Anglo-Saxon race superior by scientific reasoning, was prevalent in justifying the pride and confidence of the Aryans, a Nazi view that jaundiced other races. The thought of supremacy segregated the Nazis from others, and made them outcasts among the other democratic and communist nations, by the Nazis and the other nations' intent. In The Hobbit's Middle-earth, races are ostracized similarly and segregated geographically. The dwarves and the elves hold a long history of dispute and are often not seen interacting kindly, while the wargs, goblins, trolls, and other races are likewise isolated and prideful of their own, although contemptuous towards other kinds. Although not one race dominates like the Aryan view in the 1930s Europe, each race can be portrayed as its own outcast through the novel, especially as Bilbo travels on his own to lands where other heinous creatures lure. Background from J.R.R. Tolkien, too, provides the reader with essential information to classify Bilbo as an outcast. During the Great War, Tolkien had been a lieutenant and communications officer for the English. Because of his priorities at Oxford University, Tolkien eventually was drafted after he finished his degree. Nonetheless, the war front was more treacherous than many had anticipated, and during Tolkien's great stresses and dangers, he hid in trenches and wrote narratives, eventually becoming the archetypes for his Lord of the Rings series. Hence, unlike the nationalistic soldiers, Tolkien grew disillusioned with war and longed for peace. Such pleas and desires for peace can evidently be seen through Bilbo Baggins, especially at the dawn of the Battle of Five Armies. Bilbo consistently strives to avert violence and even betrays the dwarves by giving the precious Arkenstone to the dwarves' foes in an attempt to prevent battle. His pacifist behavior differs from the pugnacious dwarves, who would nearly kill themselves to guarantee an opulent future. Hence, a background of Tolkien allows the reader to further comprehend Bilbo's motives and his reasons for them, further identifying him as an outcast among his belligerent friends. Transitioning to Walt Whitman's An Army Corps on the March, the poem itself provides a mere description of the war battle scene. Specific diction such as whip, rumble, and sweat provide one-word descriptions of the awful situation that these men are experiencing. The imagery and quick descriptions too provide the upsetting tone that the soldiers feel, a sense of hopelessness and defeat. Dust covered and with artillery dispersed, the men seemed to be frustrated and fearful, emphasized by the incessant descriptions of their toils through the one lengthy sentence and the free verse, as if Whitman had been scribbling his thoughts down with no sense of organization. Hence, a new lens would merely display the trouble that these men were experiencing. Nonetheless, to further classify these men as outcasts among the society, a historical lens provides essential background information of the era. Written during the 19th century, towards mid-century there had been much fervor and excitement for war, and many men had voluntarily enlisted for both Northern and Confederate armies during the Civil War. Indeed, describing a certain war of the Civil War, most likely the Battle of Gettysburg, this poem serves as an antithesis from the presumed romantic notions about war, and it instead describes the hopelessness and suffering that yields from battle. Thus, the men of dread in this battle serve as the outcasts in a society that seems to romanticize and support war. Also seeming to relate to the war is Herman Melville's Night March. Nonetheless, this work is entirely figurative, describing a rich celestial scene that is much unlike the terrors on the battlefront, as Whitman had tersely described. A significant giveaway of the comparison can be seen by the heavenly-like diction. Words such as beaming, stream, and twinkling reveal that some exciting celestial body is being described. Also, legions and silence further disprove the assumption that this text is about a literal army on the battlefront. An army of men, no matter how diligent and motivated, cannot march completely silent. According to physics, this is nearly impossible. Men in an army do not usually march in legions, and definitely do not march in open ranks, as it states in the poem. A metaphor to stars in space is further emphasized as it mentions that the setting has boundless plains, much like the oxygenless, ever-going abyss of outer space. The last stanza, too, provides a philosophical input by doubting the existence of a divine being. It states no chief in view, implying that the stars are self-piloted. From this, a new lens therefore provides a key understanding that this poem describes stars in space rather than an army during war. Because Melville wrote this during the time of the Civil War, some may be obfuscated and would immediately connect this to the war. Hence, a historical output may not be the best to interpret this poem. Still, a historical lens provides the information that many groups doubted God during the era, as had been with the rise of rationality and transcendentalism, and this poem adequately supports the potential of this notion. Overall, through all three texts, outcasts are prevalent, as conveyed through either historical or new lens. Clearly, Bilbo is forcefully and willingly the outcast in Tolkien's The Hobbit. In army poems, Whitman's An Army Corps in the March explicates that those who are disillusioned with war are outcasts among the 19th century romanticizing society. Melville's Night March, on the other hand, emphasizes how those who doubt the existence of God are still outcasts, for although the era witnessed the rise of rationality and transcendentalism, the majority of society still worshiped God and remained faithful. A number of connections, too, can be pulled from the three works. War is usually the effect of tensions between two or more groups, usually based on territory, wealth, or even race. For these reasons, it is deduced that a group's supremacy may yield conflicts and tensions. War can be considered a tension, and although stars do not necessarily correlate, Melville wrote this poem to question the existence of God because of the horrors witnessed during war. The competition of race can be seen through the general plot and especially the battle of five armies in The Hobbit, while the Nazi view of Aryan supremacy during the era too displayed the resulting conflicts and tensions. World War II. Another connection between the works includes the notion that an overabundance of violence may trigger pleas for peace. Bilbo constantly attempts to prevent war and literally keeps himself from the battle in an isolated area higher in the lonely mountain. While Whitman proves that war is rather terrorizing than pleasurable, and Melville doubts the existence of divine because of the horror of violence, the two army poems can hence commensurate to viewpoints that rebuke war and violence. During both Civil War and World War II, many groups began to gather and advocate peace, and eventually this peace would prevail. Nonetheless, because of the fervor for war during the times in which these texts were written, Melville, Whitman, and Bilbo Baggins were unfortunately classified as outcasts. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching.